Welcome to the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
Hello, everybody. This is Natasha Helfer from the Natasha Helfer podcast, and this is where we try to dismantle things like shame and build emotional strength and wellness. So welcome to the show. With me, I have Allan Alexander. I'm super excited to have a great chat with him today about emotional intelligence, and specifically from the perspective of working with men, people who have penises, people who identify as men, people who've been socialized as men. So anybody who would fall under that category. We know we have a lot of trans and non-binary folks out there that are, may identify or not identify with these things. And we're definitely talking more than just about what genitalia you have as far as that's concerned. So Allan works for me at my group practice at Symmetry Solutions. And we've just had a wonderful time since he joined us last year, getting to know him better and everything that he brings to the table. So Allan, why don't we just spend a little bit of time just introducing yourself and tell us more about who you are and your background and what you bring to kind of your experience as a therapist.
Sure. Yeah, I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. So what that means is basically I'm trained to look at interpersonal issues or intrapersonal issues, so individual or relationship issues. It's all through the frames of relationships. How are your relationships going at work, with your spouse, with your kids, with your family, with people at general, the public, because that's all people that we interact with on a daily basis. And so it's all about how are those relationships functioning for you. See, this is career 3.0 for me. I retired from the county of San Diego after being a case manager and social worker for a really long time. And I decided I wanted to up my game into the therapy end of things. And so I went and got my master's when I was in my 50s. So I was the oldest kid on campus there for a while. And then I became licensed. I'm now licensed in California and Utah. And I'm really happy to be joining Natasha in how she tries to help alleviate any sort of misconceptions and shed light. And, like they say, sunshine is the enemy of almost anything that's kept in the dark or secret or repressed or anything like that. And so we're just trying to spread sunshine in the form of knowledge. And that's what this group is really about, is trying to bring some knowledge to this area of emotional intelligence, because being raised as a male in society, I know what it's like to go through the whole boys don't cry and cowboy up and, all that kind of stuff. All those things that we don't really put them in context as they're happening to us. They just become normal for us. But the cumulative effect is that it shuts us down emotionally. We're not as in touch with our own feelings as much as we should be or could be. I hate the word should, as much as we could be. And, it's that blockage. It's that inability to recognize, regulate, use effectively in healthy ways, and recognize when emotions are being used in an unhealthy way towards you. So it's a two-way street. It empowers you to understand the power of your emotional life, in your own relationships, and then in how those are being used and interacted with you from other people. And having that knowledge, that awareness, that's all what building emotional muscle is. And I leaned into that undeniably more masculine kind of trope because it is like an underused muscle. At first, when you try and lift something, and I don't know, I kind of got this idea when I injured my leg and I had to have my leg immobilized because I had knee surgery. And then the very first time I went to physical therapy and the therapist said, lift your leg. My brain was like, lift. But my leg did nothing because it just didn't have the tone. It was not used.
Right.
And so these underused muscles, even our emotional muscles, need developing. And so in the beginning, you do some light lifting, but over time, you don't notice that the more you do it, the better you get at it and the easier it becomes. And it's really crucial to really improving everybody's relationships. The study after study after study shows that the more emotionally intelligent you are, the fewer risk factors you have for conflict and misunderstanding in your relationships. You have more stable long-term relationships. You do better at work, tend to get promoted more because you're seen more with like leadership qualities and things like that. And that you can manage people. People who can effectively manage other people are highly valued. So this has real world consequences, both emotionally, physically, financially, intimately, in all aspects of your life.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great overview of everything we're going to talk about today. So one of the things that you mentioned right off the bat, which I'm not sure we totally started off as a group. So you are developing a group. You have developed a group called Building Emotional Muscle. It's a support/educational group.
Mm-hmm.
This is starting beginning of April, I believe. So if you're interested in registering for that, by all means, visit our website, symmetrypath.com/groups, and you can start thinking about that registration process. What another thing that you kind of are bringing up, which I'd like to kind of start with, is this concept of emotions and how we, at least here in the United States of America, have a lot of kind of stereotypes or overall cultural ideas around what emotion is, what it's about, whether or not emotion is valuable. And this is colored with wide sweeping brushes through the lens of patriarchy, Judeo-Christianity, politics and legal systems, a lot of different contextual systemic approaches to emotion. So as we talk about these things, I want people to remember this may or may not fit your individual experience, but it is this sense of kind of, I'd like to invite everybody to think, do these stereotypes affect me in that way? I think that one of the things we just kind of, and you kind of already alluded to this, people who are born with a penis tend to get different messages from our culture around emotions than people who are born with a vagina or a vulva, right? And so, and there's pros and cons to both of these. And typically, in my view, we see emotion as weak. If you think about like when a female political leader, for example, if she would have tears running down her face, that is seen as an expression of weakness and not being strong or grounded. And you already mentioned some comments that a lot of little boys receive, like, don't be a sissy, stop crying, cowboy up, don't be like a girl, that's girl stuff, right? So we very much gender our ideas around emotion, even though the research does not show that we as human beings really differ that much in our need for emotional expression and our need for emotional capacity and emotional validation.
Like it or not, emotions are standard equipment for all human beings, but if they're unaccessed, then they're undeveloped, just like any other part of or facet of our life. Anything that we don't access and that we don't use on a regular basis, our bodies love to be extremely energy efficient, including our brain and all of our processes. So what you aren't using, then your body, your brain is not going to automatically just shift resources to that and go, oh, but you need that. You might need that later. So we're going to go ahead and spend the time and the effort to really make sure that you're caught up on that and that you're up to speed on that. It doesn't work that way. If you don't use it, then it doesn't really get developed. And that's what this is about, is to give you the foundational tools that then go forth, use things in a very pro-social, pro-relationship way, and then be able to carry that throughout your life. These are tools. I always look at these as tools in your tool belt. Here's a tool that you permanently own now and that you can use going forward in life to benefit you in all of your interactions.
Yeah, and I think even the interesting thing when we say, well, I became emotional, what that typically means is I started crying. which ignores the 500 different emotions that we may have. I mean, we don't say when we're laughing, oh, I'm getting emotional, or when I'm angry, sometimes we say I'm getting emotional. But it's again, it's an interesting way of what we think being emotional means. So that's one thing that I think you'll definitely cover in your group is the variety of emotions that there are, whether or not we're emotionally fluent, meaning do we have more language than just I'm mad, I'm sad, I'm happy, right? Those are typically the three the three emotions that most people tend to be able to. But when saying things like, well, I'm confused, or I'm conflicted, I'm betrayed, I'm just so many different emotions that you can think about. So going back to kind of these gendered messages that we receive, I think that women too tend to get this idea that although that they're more allowed to express emotion, that a lot of those emotions need to be tempered by a sense of being polite or kind to others. So a lot of times people who grow up with female bodies or socialized to be female don't even, though they have access to maybe more emotional awareness, they're not always allowed to express that. And a lot of times for people who are male, they're encouraged to express emotion more in aggressive formats. So it's through anger, irritability, even in the research around depression, when you think about the criteria for depression, you think about being sad and hopeless and moody or, despairing. But we oftentimes find that men who present with depression are actually presenting more with irritability.
Yes. And that you're right. And that isn't in the diagnostic criteria. And I actually had a disagreement with a psychiatrist over that about irritability should be one of the criteria, especially for men. And he goes, well, that's a criteria for youth, but that's not a criteria for adults. But anyway, we had an interesting disagreement about that. And, aggression versus assertiveness is a real nuanced area that we really need to get into a lot. And we do talk about it, because the number one most acceptable emotion, socially acceptable emotion for men to display is anger. Anger can legitimately be a standalone emotion all on its own. It comes in many forms. Righteous indignation is a form of anger. But we need to be more nuanced about it. We need to understand it better, because the majority of the time, the way that it's being expressed and that it comes out in relationships, anger is actually a secondary emotion, which means that basically there's other underlying emotions that were unrecognized and therefore unable to be healthily expressed and processed and experienced. Therefore, you just it builds up and builds up and builds up, and then you kind of pop your top. When I was working in juvenile hall, I worked with kids a lot on emotional regulation, because they're at that age where emotions run very high, but they've also been through some extremely traumatic experiences. So the need for emotional regulation keeps them safe and keeps them out of trouble. I used to talk about the emotional soda bottle that you have in your chest. And life comes along and shakes it up. And we all know what happens to a soda bottle when you shake it up. But emotional regulation is, now we get in, I don't know if you want to get into the components yet, but basically emotional awareness is just, did I even notice my soda bottle got shook? Am I that in contact with my feelings to even understand there's a process going on inside of me that I can even acknowledge or deal with? Emotional regulation is letting that cap open a little bit and letting that pressure out in a healthy way, then tightening it back down. That's all part of emotional regulation. Is how you release and process emotions, and then how you also rein them in, because emotional regulation is not about denying feelings. It's just about letting them have an appropriate place in your life, informing you, but not controlling you.
Yes. And I do think that sometimes gets misinterpreted, because we tend to go on pendulum shifts, when we're trying to change things about society, whatever. So for a long time, it was like, everybody just bottle up your emotions. Nobody wants to see that, that's not couth or polite or manly or all that kind of stuff.
Oh,
But
yeah.
we've kind of been talking a lot about emotions. So now it's like, well, just express your emotions. And I hear this a lot of times with couples and couples therapy. It's like, well, it's not healthy for me to suppress my emotions. So you should be able to be okay with my venting and my anger and and yet we know that expression of emotion can become emotionally abusive, right? And so
Yes.
how do we come somewhere in the middle where, yes, we can express any emotion is valid, there's no such thing as bad or good emotions, while at the same time not using our emotions in ways that harm ourselves or others?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, that a lot of that comes into motivation, which is another component. So we've talked about emotional awareness. Do I even know what's going on? Can I feel that? Am I in touch with that? Emotional regulation. But then another part is motivation. And that is when you start to communicate with somebody, there's intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. Extrinsic motivations are anything you do for a reward or to avoid punishment. Intrinsic, your internal ones, they break down to 3 core emotional motivators, and we go over those. And the literature and the science, by the way, Daniel Goleman in 1995 is the one that came up with the 5 components of emotional intelligence. And then somebody else later or earlier called it EQ instead of like an IQ, like how smart you are. This EQ, like how emotionally intelligent you are.
Right.
But his 5 components, I use those, and motivation has those 3 core components, which is why do you even need to communicate with another person emotionally in the first place? Because cognitively, when we communicate with people, that's usually just for facts. Did you take out the trash? Did you pay that bill? Did the dog get walked? Did you pick the kids up from school? Who's got the doctor's appointment? Things like that. These are facts. Emotions tend to add all of that other kind of technicolor to life, right? The importance of it, the breadth, the depth, and all of that. But the 3 core emotional components are the 3 C's, which is control, competency, and connectedness. Nobody likes to feel like life's out of control. So of course we try to connect with other people because we want to try and feel like we can get things back under control. And that speaks to number 2, competency. We like to feel like we're good at navigating this. Like I can connect with people. I can navigate these relationships. I'm effective at managing this without people feeling hurt and upset, or me or anybody feeling like they weren't heard or abused. And then connectedness. It's all about connecting to other people because we are social creatures. Even the most lone wolf, introverted persons of us still has people they connect to. It's a much smaller group, but we still have people we intimately connect to. So it's like a 3-legged stool. If one of these is not functioning, then you're still teetering. You're trying to balance on 2 legs. So I always like to say it can be one or all 3. And just calling out that process, just being aware enough to go, oh, wow, our conversation, our difficult discussion, our argument is now starting to spiral. It's really starting to escalate. This is a really good moment where you can go, things feel like they're really starting to get a little out of control or heated or whatever's going on here. I was just trying to connect with you and I can see I didn't do that well. Or life was feeling really out of control and I was just trying to feel like things were back in control. Or I was just feeling like I can't get anything right. So control and competency and connectedness, if you just kind of call out that process, as soon as you tell the other person exactly what you were trying to do, things kind of come back down. They de-escalate. And it puts you both back on the equal footing emotionally, because now the other person is not guessing your motivation or assuming your motivation. You've told them your motivation.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I'm glad you brought up EQ versus IQ. When we're talking about emotional intelligence, it's not that we're saying people are dumb or stupid or they're many of us are highly intelligent people, that doesn't always necessarily mean that we're highly effective in our relationships and in dealing with some of these things that we've been talking about. I think another thing that society does is that it divorces, or it pits two words together, emotion and logic, right? So if you're emotional, that means you're being illogical. If you're being logical, like logic is more important or better than being emotional. And so I think it's really important to, instead of divorcing those two concepts, of kind of making a partnership between them, because we know that people who only rely on logic and not emotion actually miss a whole lot of things that are important for effective, like you said, leadership styles, effective romantic and sexual types of relationships, etc. Parenting, if you're only dealing with logic and not attaching to your child emotionally, you're really missing a whole lot of potentially good things that could be happening there. And then we also know that emotion without logic can lead to a lot of misinterpretation of stories, what things supposedly mean, kind of like you're saying about motivation.
That's kind of the monkey at the zoo, the emotion without the logic. That's just, yeah, that's
right. So you can feel like really justifiably angry or sad, but then the meanings attached to that are not always based on kind of a logical approach to what might be happening. So these are the things. I'd like to kind of just go through a list. I mean, there's tons of things you can Google around emotional intelligence, but I'd like to kind of go through a list of what, when we're talking about emotional intelligence, how does that actually show up? What does it look like? So that we can start wondering, like, yeah, how am I doing in these areas? And I'm hopeful that your answer as you listen to these lists is not yes, I am, or no, I'm not. It's more like, where in the spectrum are you? Because I think most of us are on the spectrum of doing well at some of these things, not so well at others. Most of us deal with feeling defensive at times or feeling emotionally dysregulated at times. So yeah, so have some self-grace as you listen to some of these things. But I think one of the main things, you've kind of already talked about it, is being able to identify and describe what other people are feeling. And a lot of times this is just through body language. If your partner comes in the door at the end of the day, what are you picking up from their energy, from their, from their facial expressions, even before they've said anything? And this is kind of a typical thing where somebody will say to a partner, well, is something wrong? No, everything's fine. So and you're like, oh, something is not matching here, like what's coming out of your mouth and the energy that I'm getting from you are not totally in sync, right? So that would be a sign of emotional intelligence, that you'd be able to pick up on that something is awry, right? And that something's not matching. I think also just being aware of people's strengths and limitations, including your own, right? So being able to see people through kind of like a grace lens, like, this person's really good at this, but this is kind of some of their weaknesses. And that doesn't mean I need to change them or that I need to change myself, but more of an acceptance of who people are. So that goes along with this kind of being able to be self-confident at the same time being able to, that doesn't mean that you do no wrong. Like, I can be confident in spite of my weaknesses, and I know what my weaknesses are, and I'm very capable of having discussions about my weaknesses without it becoming a big attack. Like, oh my gosh, this means you don't love me, you don't like me because you offered me a critique. That's actually probably pretty spot on, if that makes sense. Yes?
Yes. Yeah. The acknowledge, competency, again, one of the core emotional motivators is not only knowing, is not, feeling effective at life is really, it's this pathos and logos, it's your strength and weaknesses, it's this holistic view, and the greater you know your whole self. And that's what this does, is it helps you develop a broader, bigger, more holistic view of who you are and where you're at in all of these things. And the more you understand that, wow, I'm really weak in this area, but my spouse is really good at that. That actually makes you a really good partner, because then you're able to either let go of something that maybe you felt like, oh, I should be better at this. I'm not yet. Maybe I want to develop it and get it there. But in the meantime, wow, look at this really great strength I have in a partner over here. And that's what makes this awareness, this development of your emotional intelligence so crucial to relationships. Because then, instead of so much focusing on where I'm not good and what my faults are, it allows you to start reaching out and leveraging strengths of your partner And that's a sign of emotional intelligence in itself, is being able to let go of and not feel so hurt over what my shortcomings are or the areas that I might not be especially good at, accepting your own individuality, knowing where you need to push and grow or want to push and grow, or areas where you're like, you know what, I'm really great with where I'm at on this. And I have a partner that really compliments me in this area. And, and to a large degree, that's why we fall in love with people, is because I think we do kind of innately understand that this person has qualities that are maybe very similar to what I have. So there's kind of a congruence going on. But then I think there's also this compensatory type of attraction that goes on. It's like, wow, this is a person that I'd really trust to have at the other end of my teeter-totter of life. It's not somebody that's emotionally unintelligent or unempathetic or anything like that. Oh, they're just going to bail off and let me drop. That we're going to counterbalance each other. When I'm doing well, I can hold you up. And, it goes back and forth. This adds a dynamic to relationships that's really healthy, so they don't stay static, that you are processing and evaluating where you're at emotionally and everything else. And you're able to shift with that.
Yeah, which goes right into another component of emotional intelligence, which is flexibility. Are we flexible or are we rigid in our approaches? Are we growth minded versus fixed minded, right? So the ability to let go of mistakes, the ability to, be able to say, okay, yes, that was problematic, but we've addressed it and we can move on. And that's both for others and for yourself, right?
Oh, yeah.
Ability to accept and embrace change and things that are happening. Like our worlds are forever changing, even though most of us resist change in some ways. But whether it's just the natural process of aging or really big changes like unemployment or COVID or, whatever kind of comes into life, we're constantly having to face change. And how resilient are we to that? And I think along with flexibility goes this idea of curiosity for others, right? So instead of holding to stories that you might have, stereotypes you might have, it's like, can I actually be curious and be questioning and being open to other possibilities than the biases that I have already kind of set up in my brain.
Really relates heavily to the other two components. Motivation, self-awareness, self-regulation are three of the components. The other two components are empathy and social skills. So empathy develops out of understanding your own motivation and not guessing what other people's motivations are, because we constantly overestimate our own ability to guess what other people's motivations are. We're really super confident in our ability to do that, but we're really bad at actually getting it right a majority of the time. And a typical example of that might be when earlier I said about actually calling out what your emotional motivation was. You might say to your spouse or your partner, wow, I can see that you're getting mad, I'm getting mad. What I was really trying to do is connect with you here and I misstepped. Can we try again? And then you might hear your spouse say something like, I'm not mad. We tend to guess a lot because we think we're really good at it. And we want that congruence. We want us to be on the same page, which is why our confidence is so high. But we're really bad at getting it right. But that's also part of empathy. Empathy is not only being able to understand, it's being able to feel what someone else might be feeling. It's not feeling for them, it's feeling with them. And in order to feel with them, then you have to have that emotional curiosity that, which is born out of self-awareness and self-regulation. The more you learn about yourself, the more you recognize it in others, because emotions and body language and tone and all of that, it's all a mirror for how our conversation is going. And if you're not picking up on clues, here's where you're missing the mark and things get escalated and people feel misunderstood. So that development of empathy is really crucial. And then of course, social skills is putting it all together. It's all of these other four inaction in the relationship.
And even if, as you, said that example of like, oh, I'm getting mad, you're getting mad. And then the other person says, I'm not mad. I don't know what you're talking about. That's a really interesting, complex space. Because in my experience, both people were usually right. Right. So, and this is where it's kind of like, especially in marriages and long-term relationships, one of Gottman's principles is, are you allowing your partner to influence you? Like, so if my partner is saying like, this is kind of what's coming off of you energy wise, right? And this is what I'm noticing. And I'm like, nope, you're wrong. You're absolutely wrong. I might be missing some input that my partner has about how I present, right? I think I've shared this example many times on other interviews, but my ex-spouse would tell me, I don't really appreciate your rage eyes, right? I'd be like, I don't have rage eyes while I'm, like, for those of you who are just listening to me on the video, I'm showing my rage eyes, right? And I really didn't believe I had rage eyes. I thought I was being quite calm and collected in my presentation of my feelings. And I wasn't aware in my early 20s that my face would kind of contort in this way, that I was being very communicative with my body in a way that I wasn't quite intellectually making sense of. And so if I hadn't been willing to listen to that feedback, which at first I wasn't, first I got defensive and I was like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have rage eyes. I'm fine. But when I was able to listen to that feedback and go, maybe he has a point, maybe there's something here. I remember my parents having rage eyes. Maybe maybe there's something here. And at the same time, that doesn't mean that what I'm saying isn't valid either, because I may really not feel like I'm enraged, maybe I am upset, but I wouldn't necessarily say I'm enraged. So he would have had to have some emotional intelligence as well to be influenced by me and to say, well, maybe this isn't, maybe how you're coming across or how I'm interpreting your facial contortion is not exactly correct to the meaning I'm ascribing to it. And so you can see how just in that very simple interaction, there's only two people. Imagine a room full of people, like in a board meeting or something, but that can either get very defensive with each other and get very binary and get very kind of like backlash into their positions and go, no, this is my truth. And that's the only thing that will be allowed to be, considered in this moment. Or we can lean into that curiosity and that flexibility of going, I wonder what I'm getting right here. I wonder what I'm not totally getting right in this situation. Yes?
Sure. And I think that goes back to what some of our core motivations are. All of them can be taken to the extreme and misused. Like control can become controlling. Competency can be the need to always be right. And connectedness can become overly monitoring or clinging or needful, to where the other person actually is starting to feel pushed away. And this is all a part of the entire package of emotional intelligence. When you call those processes out, when you state what your motivation is, then you provide the other person opportunity to say, well, you missed the mark, or you didn't, or wow, I really felt that, but it felt too much. These are really great spaces. It opens up space for discussion, which is what this is all about, instead of just assumptions and reactions.
Yes.
And part of that social skills part is where we kind of put it all together. And some of our greatest allies and friends are things we use every day in the therapeutic space as therapists ourselves. It's active listening. If you already have an answer on the tip of your tongue, you're stopped listening. Stop having answers. Pretend you don't know. Really listen to what the other person is saying. Hear the words. Ask questions.
Yeah.
Be curious. Curiosity is one of the greatest things you can bring to a relationship, because that avoids assumptions. And then reflect. Repeat it back to the person. Here's what I heard. Here's what I heard where you're at, or what you're asking. That gives, again, that chance for course correction. So the more you talk about things in an unassuming way, in a questioning way, in a curious way, and sometimes the good old principle of fake it till you make it can really help you here, where it's like, just pretend you don't know this person anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Pretend this is just some clerk at the 7-Eleven or something, and go, what is this clerk at the 7-Eleven trying to tell me?
Mm-hmm.
Because that removes that whole conceptualization of that other person that might be getting in the way. If you've developed some really entrenched assumptions and negative interaction patterns around each other.
Yeah, because a lot of these things are happening in nanoseconds in our brain, right? It's hard to stop something or become super self-aware about something that is just kind of on autopilot. And whether that's how you were raised and kind of the conflict styles that you kind of grew up having role modeled to you, the emotional expressions that were role modeled to you, what people told you about how you could express yourself emotionally or not express yourself. And so those things are very difficult to, I think a lot of us could listen to this interview, for example, and go, yes, I agree, and still go tell our partner to F off tonight, right? And,
Sure.
and basically like, be like, well, hold on, what happened? What happened between this time when I was listening to this podcast and now, completely losing it with my partner. So, and this is why it's important. I mean, it's important to start with self-awareness, but it's also important to practice these skills and to be open to the feedback of the other person involved, because sometimes when we are deregulated, it's kind of already too late. Like my physiology has already kind of gone there. My heartbeat's racing, my throat's closing up, my head is feeling like it's going to explode, whatever those things are. My stomach is churning. And so this is why a timeout is oftentimes very effective.
Yeah.
It's just kind of saying, okay, I need time. And oftentimes that's like 20 minutes to help you kind of either go take a walk, go take a lukewarm shower, go lie down and take a quick nap, whatever those things are, to help you kind of get back into a space where your physiology hasn't taken over. And I also want to just point out that deregulating, I think most people would say, oh, the deregulation looks like somebody screaming, somebody throwing plates, somebody, saying a bunch of F-bombs, but deregulation can also look like completely withdrawing, shutting down, not doing the silent treatments, refusing to engage with your partner, feeling flooded. So it's not always this, rupture of I tend to be more the the Latin like I'll be the yeller and the and the screamer, but I grew up with a Germanic English father who was very much the more like containing, until he really blew up. Then he'd really blow up, but for the most part it would be very, very contained and just withdraw. So
Sure.
that's all part of how we are not regulated, right? And it's hard to know how to, and that's why we talk about conflict avoidance and all that happens in a lot of couples.
It's also in one of my favorite things in the fair fighting rules that I like to share with couples is, I'm not some therapist that's just going to go like, stop it. Well, just stop it. That's not going to change anything. Stop fighting. That's so naive. Yes, fight. Have those difficult conversations, have those really important discussions about these really important things in your life. But one of the great things about the fair fighting rules is always have a tap out word or something like that. I especially like them for when you're somewhere else other than your own home and you understand what's at stake and things are starting to get to an area where a conversation might start turning not so favorably for you and you're in a public place, like especially over the holidays. I helped a lot of my couples understand that over the holidays, you're going to see friends and family, you're going to be in unfamiliar, you're going to travel, you're going to be stressed out, you're juggling kids and flights and family and everything else. This is a perfect opportunity for emotions to really go off the rails and become really kind of go over the top and get in the driver's seat. So having this, like these tap out words or these safe words or these take a break words or phrases can be really, really helpful. Make it something so that somebody else isn't really going to know what it means. Like you two share an activity like, I don't know, mountain biking. And you realize that things are starting to get escalated and you're in a place where you can't really have this conversation, then you might really turn to your spouse and say something like, sure could use a mountain bike ride right now. And that's a clue that, yes, I'm hearing you, but now's not the time or space, and we will talk about it later. And once you have these code words, these code phrases for you, you'll find it's much easier to handle things in public or at other people's houses or wherever. And then when you're by yourselves, getting back to your point, please have a tap out word, and make it something that is really something significant to you or so out of the blue that it's really going to get your attention. So when the other person says something like applesauce, then you're going to know applesauce. Oh, time to take a break.
Yeah. And that's much more useful than having somebody saying something like, I'm done talking right now. I can't handle this anymore. I can't take you anymore. I'm done with this conversation, because that can feel like to the other person, like, well, why do you get to decide that this conversation is over? But when you have a timeout strategy that both of you have agreed upon, when you're not escalated, then you recognize, okay, no, either one of us has the right to do this at any point, and that there's this agreement that we are going to come back to the table. It's not just a tap out forever, oh, I'm done with this conversation. And because that can raise the anxiety of the person who wants things resolved, obviously.
Oh, sure.
But the last thing I want to talk about, because I know we're running out of time. So you and I work with primarily, not always, but a lot of times, people who are coming from high demand religions, conservative spaces, where a lot of these gender roles were a huge part of people's stories about how a man was supposed to present emotionally, how a woman was supposed to present emotionally, and why we have found it really useful to offer a group like you're providing, kind of in this gendered way, that's kind of like for men who want to develop this. So that's not to imply that, women have all emotional intelligence figured out. It's not to imply that, but I think a lot of times creating spaces where people with similar backgrounds, similar stories, similar kind of wounds in regards to why emotions may have been a difficult thing to figure out or to know how to feel more confident about can be useful. And that's why we've created kind of some of these spaces that are gendered, even though we want to be as inclusive as possible as well, right? Like we're saying to trans folks, non-binary folks, etc. Anything you want to add to that?
When the ideas of how you can emotionally show up for another person become so entrenched that you're denying some essential humanity of yourself, because like I said earlier, sorry folks, but everybody comes equipped with a full range of emotions, and your emotions are going to have an emotional experience inside your body, whether you like it or not. And suppressing it is obviously not working. So what do you do with it? How do you handle it? This is what this group is here for. It's to get you started on the foundational aspects of both education and practice, and those social skills. That's the practice part. That completes the metaphor of building emotional muscle. You're going to have to go home and do the work. You're going to have to start exercising those emotional muscles if you want them to get stronger, if you want to become more sure of them, if you want to have more control, and if you want to improve relationships. So this isn't effortless. If all I had to do was provide information, then just by the sheer fact that I went to grad school and read all the theories and most of the up-to-date information means I should be the most together, wonderful person on the face of the planet.
What? We're not, Allan?
And it's just not true. These
Therapists are not the most emotionally intelligent people out there? What?
Everybody struggles. It's a human condition. but it doesn't have to be as disruptive or divisive or unhealthy as it has been in your life. And maybe you're not even having a bad time with it right now. You're just looking for a chance for some personal growth.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
Love to see you.
Perfect. So when exactly does this group start, Allan?
It's Wednesday evenings. It's all 4 Wednesdays in April and the first 2 Wednesdays of May. It starts at 6 p.m. Pacific time, which is where I'm at in California. So it would be 9 p.m. for the East Coast folks. And it goes an hour and a half. So East Coast folks, you'd have to push it to 10:30. Or you can drop out early, depending on life circumstances. People have obligations. I understand that. All the groups are recorded. Any text that's exchanged in chat is captured. And then, of course, I provide the slides for each week's presentation. I put that in Dropbox. You guys are the only ones that can access it. And yeah, there you go. So you always have access to the materials. If you miss a week, we all have life. We all have families. We get sick. We have deadlines. Things come up. That way, if you miss a week, you can catch up.
Right. And this is an online group, so it doesn't matter where you find yourself geographically. We've even had international folks join some of these groups that we provide at Symmetry. So they're not typical therapy groups, but they are support groups and educational groups that can really help at least get you started on some information as to how you can move forward, and then maybe find more local resources to help you move forward if you want. So
Absolutely.
I'm super excited. I know that, you've done this group, I think twice now before.
This is going to be the 3rd time.
Yeah, we've gotten great reviews. I think also there's not, I think about, again, stereotypically men have spaces where they get together to talk about sports. They have, they have places to talk about business. They have, even places to talk about sometimes kids, but not so much about their emotions. And I know that that's something that when I do my male sexual shame group, or when you've done this kind of building emotional support group, a lot of the men who attend say that in particular, like it was amazing to be able to be in a place to sit with other men where we could really express and talk about things that we don't feel like there's a lot of permission in our regular lives to talk about. So that's really powerful. That's a really powerful healing component to these groups. So
I've loved every group. I've learned so much from every group. That's why I love doing what I do, because as much as I try and educate and help others, it comes back, so much. And I just love it, love it, love it. And looking forward to doing it again.
Yeah. And Andy asks, where do I find more information? So you can go right to our group practice website. It's symmetrypath.com. There's a group, even if you do /groups, you should get right there. And I'll make sure to include that link here on this Facebook Live, as well as when this podcast releases next week, we'll have it on the audio files as well. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Allan, for your time. Thank you, Doggies, for giving us a lot of emotional regulation examples. And we'll catch you next time. Thank you, Allan.
Well, thank you, Natasha, and thanks everybody, and hope to see you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Natasha Helfer Podcast. To help keep this podcast going, please consider donating at natashahelfer.com and share this episode. You can find Natasha on Facebook at Natasha Helfer, LCMFT, CSTS, and at Natasha Helfer MFT on Instagram and TikTok. You can find all her cool resources at natashahelfer.com. The intro and outro music for this episode is by Otter Creek. This podcast was edited by Ashley Pacini.
There is a place where time slows to nature's pace, and there is space there to find yourself in her embrace. Some places should be left alone. Now, so we can always go to the homeland of the heart. of our human history etched on her canyon walls, alongside Earth's mysteries. Some places should be left alone. Något geschehen so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart. Deep in our cities, we sleep without her stars, yet still her presence sustains us from afar. Some places should be left alone. Något geschehen so we can always go to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart, to the homeland of the heart.